Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another iteration of our International Defense Policy Series. Today, I'd like to welcome Ambassador Tim Martin. A career diplomat, Ambassador Martin has led in the epicenters of geopolitical crises from Somalia to Kandahar. During Canada's Somalia mission, he was the Horn of Africa Foreign Policy Officer and saw the situation unfold in both Mogadishu and Ottawa. When Canada established diplomatic relations with the Palestinian Authority, Tim went to Ramallah to open and head up Canada's representative office on the West Bank and Gaza. He was there for 3 years, from the high point of the peace process to the eruption of the Second Intifada. In Nairobi, he tracked the pillaging of Congo resources in the aftermath of the Rwanda genocide, and went on to be chairman of the Kimberley process to ban blood diamonds. Tim has served as ambassador to Colombia and Argentina, and was the last representative of Canada in Kandahar, the Rock, which is the coolest nickname you can ever have. Leading a joint Canadian-U.S. provincial reconstruction team of over 100 civilian and military personnel, Tim was responsible for delivering governance, development, humanitarian assistance, prison reform, and police training alongside the NATO military mission in Kandahar, the homeland of the Taliban. Now dedicated to writing, the topic of today's discussion on winnable peace follows his debut political thriller, Moral Hazards. I'd like to welcome Ambassador Martin to Queen's University today.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Howard. Thanks very much, Dr. Coombs. And, I worked with Howard in Kandahar, where he was the counterinsurgency advisor to General Dean Milner, head of Task Force Kandahar, who is with us today. So it's great to be with so many friends. I feel like a bit of an imposter being here in the School of Policy Studies, because I'm going to tell some stories. My book is not a policy analysis. It's not a political analysis. It's a book of stories. It's about the experiences and the observations who are people who are there on the ground. Now, I think that's a kind of truth that has an equivalent value to policy studies, can be more engaging. And then, there's a human dimension in everything we do. It's people confronted by situations. And that's what I wanted to explore in this book and tell the overall story of the last year in Kandahar that way. Now, I'm calling this talk Maximum Canada. I'm calling it Maximum Canada, and it's about Kandahar in the book, because we operated at the limit of the government of Canada's political will. We operated from top to bottom in the toughest part of a failed state. We faced extreme ethical and moral dilemmas. And we addressed human rights in the black hole of the biggest prison in Kandahar, Sarposa Prison. My role was, like Howard said, was representative of Canada in Kandahar, and director of the provincial reconstruction team. There's two parts of that. One, the Rock, that's being the ambassador to a war zone. I worked as the peer of Dean Milner, and Canada, I think, had the best provincial reconstruction team in Kandahar because we had a strong civilian contingent, strong skills, representing multiple departments of the government of Canada, working hand in hand in an integrated, coordinated way with Canadian forces. And that's really, something I want to maybe come back to. We don't see it that much, bolted together, military and civilian diplomatic capacity. We usually see it separate, segmented, not perfectly coordinated. But in the crucible of the counterinsurgency, counter-terrorist war in Kandahar, government stovepipes melted into a common mission, and that was my job on the civilian side, to manage the different civilian capabilities that we needed to respond to the reality there. And well, just from a military counterinsurgency point of view, the mantra we had, let me just step back a moment. The whole thing, started 9/11, Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden planned his attacks from a place called Tarnak Farms in Kandahar, just outside of Kandahar city. Then, of course, Operation Enduring Freedom, Taliban were toppled by special forces and an air campaign. Then a couple years later, roll forward to 2006, toppling the Taliban wasn't enough. What about extending civilian democratic governance across the whole space of Kandahar? So there was a rollout, a NATO rollout, in which troop contributing countries were given provinces. It's 34 provinces, I think, in Afghanistan. And now here's a mystery. I haven't solved this mystery, but Canada got the toughest province. Kandahar, big, ancient. The word Kandahar comes from Alexander. That's Alexander the Great. It used to be called Alexandria because that was part of his push towards India. Different culture. The Pashtun culture. That was a culture known to the Greeks. It's ancient. And two of the most important values there are hospitality and revenge. Because of the duty of hospitality, the Taliban, when it was called on to hand over Osama bin Laden, couldn't do it. Well, didn't do it, but that was part of it as well. Kandahar, pretty big, size of Nova Scotia, 1.4 million people. Kandahar city, second biggest city in Afghanistan. The enemy was the Taliban. Who knows what Taliban means? Students. I'm not saying that because I see all these students here, but students, and they're called students because they were Islamic students in the madrasas who were the ones that had an alternative, not a tough alternative at the time of the chaos of the warlords following the fall of the Soviet Union. That was a time you can't really believe in very much, but you can believe in God, and God has rules set forth, and that was their concept. It was tough. It was cruel, and led them into association with Osama bin Laden. Now let me take a step back to the Canadian political context. The government of Canada, Governor Stephen Harper, was badly shaken by the detainee crisis. And here I'm going to read an excerpt from the book that talks about that. Canada's commitment to the operations in Kandahar was initially set to expire in 2009. In the preceding months, however, it was obvious to everyone that the job of stabilization and reconstruction was not done. The mission was faltering. A renewed commitment, more resources, and a course correction were urgently needed. Prime Minister Stephen Harper struck the independent panel on Afghanistan, on Canada's future role in Afghanistan. John Manley led it, a Liberal, to advise the government on the direction forward. It recommended a revamped focus on reconstruction and development, to move from a fully military approach to one that bolted on reconstruction and development. Harper accepted the recommendations and extended the mission until the summer of 2011. That's when Dean and I both wrapped up our missions there, moved on to a police training mission, but wrapped up the combat development reconstruction mission in the province of Kandahar. Harper's acceptance was not a moment for celebration. If I can be frank about it, this is an extremely difficult mission. We don't believe it's perfect. We never have, he said. There has been no issue that has caused me as Prime Minister more headaches or more heartache than this particular mission. I don't think that's going to change in the future. That's what he said. Well, implementing the recommendations of the Manley Report necessitated a much bigger team of civilians. Moreover, it meant civilians trained to work with the Canadian forces in a military structure, counterinsurgency mission, and active war zone. And now it looks like it was going to include me. So there's three things I want to talk about, in particular, stories from the book. One is governance. Now, governance, that's a very abstract kind of concept. So I'll try and bring that down to the ground. I want to talk about our work in Sarposa Prison, a black hole for human rights, but it led to what we called the Canadian umbrella to protect human rights. And I want to talk about Mariam Sahar. That's the gender dimension. And she was the brave Afghan teenager who came to be the translator, the only female translator for the government of Canada in Kandahar. Okay, let me start with governance. I mean, you can also call this the Warlords chapter in the book. My warlord was Ahmed Wali Karzai, the half-brother of President Hamid Karzai. Now, working in governance meant working at multiple levels. One level, of course, was with Hamid Karzai, the president, and our embassy and ambassador in Kabul worked with the government of Afghanistan, the government that emerged from the Bonn Conference. Another level was of the province of Kandahar, and the governor of the province, and the warlord of the province, and then working at the lowest level. I mean, the thing about a failed state like Afghanistan is there's very little connective tissue between what happens at the capital and what happens on the ground where the people live. So approaching the question of how do you advance governance means you need to work simultaneously at all three levels. And that's part of Maximum Canada too, because diplomatically and developmentally, we had to work at every single level of the country, and a disorganized and dangerous country. So my warlord was Ahmed Wali Karzai, half-brother of the president. His qualification was being a former restaurant manager in Chicago. We were promoting democracy, and in this excerpt, I'm going to tell AWK not to interfere in the parliamentary elections. We entered the armored vehicle through the back and strapped into our 4-point seat belts, then watched the city pass by through bulletproof portholes. Little boys splashed and laughed in the irrigation ditches. Little girls in school uniforms skipped brightly on their way to classrooms that Canada had built. Women in black or sky blue burqas carried brightly colored shopping bags. Chaotic swarms of Indian motorized tricycles and cheap Chinese motorcycles dodged around and past our four-wheeled behemoth of an armored vehicle with daring unconcern. Our route took us past the central cemetery, a dusty field of serenity with scattered knots of mourners. Sometimes a few small concrete blocks marked the border of a grave, or a flat stone had been placed upright. Other times, a simple plaque displayed a few words in Arabic script. The modesty of the graves expressed the humility and equality with which the faithful are expected to depart this transitory life. Dig down 2,000 years, and the prayers for the departed are in Greek. I thought about the millennia of civilizational strata below us, and I hoped that our mark would be inscribed on the good side of history's ledger. We arrived at our destination. The soldiers dismounted and moved in patrol formation to secure a path for our entry. Invisible to us, Strike Force, AWK's personal militia and security company, would have established a deeper level of perimeter protection. Once the soldiers were in place, me, my political officer, and translator waded through a sea of humble supplicants milling about, trying to find a way past the gatekeepers. AWK wore an Afghan vest over a white button-down shirt that covered a well-fed paunch. Heavy 5 o'clock shadow darkened a light complexion that suggested an interior and nocturnal life. A droopy mustache separated fleshy lips from a big nose. His hand was clean, soft, and dry when I took it. We were both 6 feet tall, and he met my gaze directly. His dark eyes were serious and sad. We sat down across from each other. He didn't bring note takers or translators. My political officer, Greg, would write our report so that Ottawa knew exactly what was said. Friendly, businesslike, and calm, he spoke fluent English with a hint of a soft Midwestern accent that blended pleasingly with the courteous and deliberate Afghan manner of speaking. He could have been one of us. AWK survived 9 assassination attempts. Maybe that explains some of the sadness in his hooded eyes. There were numerous media allegations that AWK was vastly corrupt, had associations with the billion-dollar heroin trade and colluded with the Taliban. Congressional committees had talked about him. He was said to have a close working relationship with the CIA. Many diplomats and military leaders believed that AWK and others like him were malign actors, and that replacing them with ethical leaders, that was the only path to stability and progress for Afghanistan. My predecessor, Ben Rouswell, was one of them. When he arrived in Kandahar, Ben soon saw that Canada needed an independent understanding of the political leaders with whom we were working. So, risky as it was, he sent Canadian political officers outside the wire. The wire, that's the term that talks about, that defines the perimeter of the forward operating base we were in, Camp Nathan Smith in downtown Kandahar City. We were trying to understand the base reality, said Ben. People were furious with AWK's abuses of power, he said. He ran secret prisons for his business adversaries. If someone didn't pay up on a contract or crossed him, he'd throw them into a basement of one of his residences and hold them there. There were widespread rumors that he was involved in selling opium. A confidential U.S. embassy report, embassies send reports, to the State Department this way, and a confidential report that came out in WikiLeaks. Have you ever had anything come out on WikiLeaks, Dean? I have, and it was not good. So this is what the leaked telegram started with. While we must deal with AWK as head of the provincial council, he is widely understood to be corrupt and a narcotics trafficker. Now, Ben tried extremely hard to find a way to diminish the influence of AWK, but just before I got there to replace him, the top NATO commander in the region and the senior American civilian told Ben, call off your dogs. Another senior American said, we're here to defeat terrorists, and he's very good at fighting terrorists, so we're with him. As a result, AWK remained the most powerful man in Kandahar. As I stood beside AWK, I came to a bitter realization that when Kandaharis saw me and others cutting ribbons and announcing projects, they saw power alignment, not democracy or government legitimacy. But good guys don't come first in failed states like Afghanistan, and we were in no position to hold auditions for preferred power brokers. Building governance in that place was like weaving a basket out of snakes. I think this is this is a policy dilemma in so many places. We receive power brokers and politicians and leaders that often emerge through corrupt political cultures. And what do you do with that? My reflection is, they probably don't want to be like Canadians, and it's probably an unsuccessful or unfruitful approach to try and make them like us and appeal to their values. But I do think that there are simple, clear rules that can be laid down, like don't torture and no extrajudicial killings. So we're not going to change heart, but we can change rules. A very interesting part of this governance questions is we didn't only work with the governor and the head of the provincial council, AWK, but we worked at the lowest level at the districts with district governors and village leaders and elders. Panjwai was where we worked most intensively, and that's something that Dean and I and Howard would do together. Go to the villages, bring the elders, find out what they wanted, find out what they needed, listening to them ask for release of prisoners, but bring it down to there. When we started, the governor couldn't even go outside Kandahar city. But when we were leaving, the governor was going out, extending his writ, extending his visibility outwards. But it was tough. For example, the Taliban had a shadow government in many of the districts, a shadow justice program. Shadow police would detain people. Very present, very scary, very intimidating. So maximum Canada, from the top to the bottom, all together to move governance. You know, I'll argue that we did a great job. We did a very good job. I'm proud of it. I'm angry. I'm sad. I'm proud of it. I think there's also an argument to be made that there was an optimal moment to pivot towards political negotiations with the Taliban, and that was it. The maximum level of strength and force with Canada and the United States there. Anyway, the Canadian umbrella, an umbrella in a desert. Okay, sorry, I'm moving on to a different topic. In our team, we had members of the Corrections Canada, 4 people, experts in prisons that were part of our response to the detainee scandal, which was improving prison conditions. Terry Hackett was one of them. He came from a healing lodge in the interior of the British Columbia, came to Kandahar to head up our team there. And you know, prisons and failed states, they're black holes for human rights. People are deprived of liberty. You know, the justice system that delivers them there is faulty, to say the least, and it's dangerous. Sarposa was perhaps the most dangerous place in Kandahar city because it had threats from the inside and threats from the outside. This is a story about Terry. I sat in the Canadian Forces Tactical Operations Center trying to control my nerves. The room was dark, illuminated only by video monitors displaying feeds from high-resolution cameras located near our base. A helium spotting balloon floated over the base like a Goodyear blimp, providing video surveillance. Constant staticky chatter on the radio from patrols calling in and voices of the soldiers in communication with them. I was there as a result of a conversation I had with Terry Hackett, the head of our Correctional Service Canada team. I need to talk to you, Tim, about a night patrol tomorrow, he said. I hadn't been in the job very long and I didn't know what he was talking about. Why are you doing it at night? He said the Afghan prison service is worried that they have too many Taliban detainees in Sarposa. They need to move them up to the main prison in Kabul. The more prisoners there are in Sarposa, the more incentive there is for a prison break. He explained they do it at night so people don't see and the streets are quiet. Terry and his staff would be there to ensure humane treatment as the Afghan prison service transported prisoners to CAF, Kandahar airfield, where they'd be transferred to the larger prison in Kabul. Sarposa is the top target in Kandahar city, Terry said. If the Taliban find out about the transfer, they might break them out and get them back in the fight. They'd done it before. In June 2008, the Taliban had freed 1,200 inmates, killing 15 guards in the process. And just 5 months before my arrival in March 2010, 2 of his team were caught outside the wire during another attempt when the Taliban had simultaneously attacked the KPRT. That's the Kandahar Provincial Reconstruction Team, the base that we worked on. Simultaneously, KPRT, police headquarters, the governor's palace, Sarposa, and Ahmed Wali Karzai's home. It was the biggest attack of the year. That night, Terry was working at Sarposa with the warden on a PowerPoint presentation for NATO when a suicide bomber driving a dump truck smashed into the prison's exterior wall, blowing it up and killing 30 civilians who lived nearby. Terry felt something sharp going into the back of his head as he was blown against the wall. Shards of glass projected inward from a shattered window. The warden and Terry's close protection soldier were knocked unconscious. The clang of steel bars rang through the prison as Taliban prisoners shook their cell walls and shouted, sure, this was their chance to escape. Terry worried about the other members of his team who were down on the cell block. The troops moved fast to block the breach in the wall with a light armored vehicle. The Canadian soldiers had night vision gear, but they held their fire because they couldn't make positive target identification. The Taliban and Sarposa guards exchanged fire indiscriminately. With all the attacks around Kandahar city, our quick response force was stuck, and it couldn't get to us for several hours, he said. When help finally arrived, Terry and his team, together with the soldiers trained in tactical combat casualty care, provided first aid for injured guards and prisoners. They helped the Afghans with head counts, went back to the KPRT, got stitched up, then returned to Sarposa to restore order and shore things up, at least temporarily. By that time, it was after midnight. It was Terry's 35th birthday. Now it was my responsibility to approve the night patrol that could put him and the troops in harm's way. If anything happened, there'd be nothing I could do. Still, Terry couldn't do his job if I second-guessed him. If people thought I didn't have confidence in his judgment, it would undermine his leadership. My face hardened into a mask that hid my anxiety. Okay, I said. That's another aspect of Maximum Canada, is taking people who would normally work as civilians in the government and put them in situations not only of, real tough human rights problems and a history of that, but also, in danger of their lives at times. And it was a time when people stepped up, they did the job hand in hand with the Canadian forces. I don't know when we'll see that kind of effort again. How are we doing for time? Okay. Of course, 50% of the population of Kandahar is female. Well, obviously. But we only had one interpreter in Kandahar, who was a woman, an Afghan woman. Mariam Sahar. Mariam Sahar was Canada's first, last, and only female interpreter in Canada. She was 17 years old in 2011 when I first met her working at our provincial reconstruction team. She learned English, worked with the Department of Women's Affairs, which needed somebody passionate about women's rights to translate. And of course, because women were denied education under the Taliban, there was none that spoke English until somebody like Mariam came along in a Canadian-funded school, learned English, and could become a translator. She was born under the Taliban in February 1994. Her father was a shopkeeper who grew grapes and pomegranates on land next to their house. The family compound included her aunt, uncle, cousins, no electricity, no running water. After morning prayers, Mariam would fetch water from the community pump. There was no school for her other girls, so when she was not helping her father in the fields or her mother in the house, she played outside with her friends and cousins, searching for spent bullets whose shiny brass casings made perfect play money. Other days, she and her friends would play hide and seek among burnt-out Soviet tanks. "What are these things?" she asked her dad. "You'll learn when you're older," was his response. Once, she saw a metal object emerging from the shifting soil of the family fields. It was as long as Mariam's small arm, slender and very interesting. Crusted with gray corrosion from years in the ground, it was pointed at one end and a circle of sharp fins fanned around the tail. Mariam dug it out and brought it home to play with. "Look, Dad, I found a fish." Years later, in a training course on unexploded ordnance, she learned that it was a mortar shell that could have killed her whole family. When her family lived in Kandahar city, their home was near the stadium, used for cricket and soccer tournaments. Now, it was used by the Taliban for Friday mass prayers. Because absence would attract unwanted attention, Mariam's father always attended, but never with the family. "Don't let the children out of the house on Fridays," he told his wife. Mariam was curious. So one Friday, she slipped out of the house and joined the crowd heading into the stadium. Groups of men with big bushy beards, long hair and long robes clustered around the entrance. The Taliban attendant said to her, "Where's your stone?" "I don't have a stone," she answered. Baffled. Take this one, he said. Mariam took the fist-sized stone as if it were an entrance ticket. Inside the stadium, a big hole had been dug in the playing field. Inside was a young woman, frantic with terror, screaming, "It's not my fault. It's not my fault." At the mullah's command, the men surrounding the hole started throwing their stones. Mariam saw her dad in the stands. He rushed down to get her. Flushed with anger, he grabbed the stone from her hand, dropped it on the ground, and took her, petrified and traumatized, back home. "This is why I told you not to let her out on Fridays," he yelled at her mother. "You know there are executions after Friday prayers." Public executions in the stadium were not infrequent, scheduled right after Friday prayers to ensure a full house. For adultery, the penalty was stoning. For murder, the condemned would be tied to the goalpost and shot. Robbery was punished by the amputation of a hand. Mariam now lives with her brothers and her family in Ottawa, and she got a master's in refugee studies, works for the government, and in fact, I'll be holding a fundraiser with her next week because that school she went to, called the Kandahar Institute for Modern Studies, still exists. They're keeping a very low profile because, well, for obvious reasons, with the Taliban, they had their buses impounded, they've been closed down from time to time, but they're still teaching kids quietly, low profile. And I think it's so important that there's these small islands of possibility for women to learn computer skills and other things that will let them move fast and connect when the time comes. But Maximum Canada also involved coming up against obstacles that we didn't anticipate, like the need for female interpreters, and trying to overcome them. I think that's the kind of thing, next time Canada goes, next time we need Maximum Canada, we should think through what we learned in Kandahar. We should think through about what we learned about prisons and gender and plug that in. And if you don't see it there, you should write a letter. Now, I feel that, we're turning our back on Canada's longest war. When Prime Minister Harper came to Kandahar to say goodbye, in his speech, a big message was, this war in Afghanistan is longer than the First World War and the Second World War put together. He was ready to go. I didn't feel right about leaving when we left. I thought there was more to do. I thought we felt we kept our commitment, but it didn't mean the job was done. I feel we're turning our back on that. You probably know that we haven't been able to decide what kind of memorial we'll have to Afghanistan. And the one memorial that was brought from Task Force Kandahar, it wasn't really given access to the public in a proper way, I don't think. So how are we to think about it? Well, we were a good ally. We kept our NATO commitment in terms of Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. We did what we said we'd do, but you look at the outcome, and it's hard to know what to do with that. I think we should remember and think about how we tried to do and usually did the right thing in the most difficult circumstances. That it should be remembered by how we responded in the moment to the job we had. And we did that with courage, resourcefulness, commitment, and stamina. And that's why I think Unwinnable Peace is an important book for Canadians. And I'm very proud to speak to you about it today. I'd like to thank you very much for your attention.
All right, everyone, we have, excuse me, time for questions. We'll use the mic because it's not for the people in the room, but for the online audience and for the recording that Brian is assiduously doing in the corner. And he will in fact be very disappointed with me if we don't use the mic. So I will start though. There's a hard question online from Paul Rose Edwards. It's quite succinct, but it's penetrating. Was it worth it? Could our blood and treasure have been far better spent elsewhere in the world? Did we have any chance of success?
Well, thanks for that question, Paul. Was it worth it? I think we have to unpack that question. You can't answer that question in a simple way. It wasn't a simple experience. It was multiple experiences. I don't think you can say it was worth it to people who lost their loved ones in Afghanistan. I mean, that's just a human thing. If I lost my son there, I would say that wasn't worth it. I think you can say from a national security perspective, from a big picture international policy perspective, yes, it was worth it. We promptly met our treaty obligations. We promptly responded and helped our security partner, the United States. You know, that relationship is the bedrock of our safety and security. And we did it in the hardest place for a long time, for a really long time. I think, you know, that question begs a philosophical reckoning about what do you do when it's not a victory? And we have to have that, whether it's in business or academia or whatever. We don't always win. And we didn't win this time. So my philosophical reckoning is, did we do the right thing when we were there with what we had? Did we do it with courage? Did we do it with resourcefulness? Did we bring all the assets of the federal government together and engage Canadians? Canadians in public opinion polling at the time of that said, you know, I see the military mission, I support the soldiers, but it's not peacekeeping. It's not our traditional idea. But when Canadians started to understand, wait, it's not only a military mission, we're helping people. We're helping women, we're delivering polio vaccine, we're building roads, we're rehabilitating irrigation. And then they said, okay, I get it. I get it. We're there because of international security, but we're there as Canadians and we're helping people and they deserve it. And we did. And some of the benefits are still enduring. All those literate girls, that thousands during the time we were there were educated. It was a temporary period, but it's real and it will last forever. So that's my answer, Paul. Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much, first of all, for the speech, and I look forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
I mean, there are two parts almost in what you're talking about, as I hear it. One is there's, if I can put it, a continuation of a military mission, which seems almost simplest part, because essentially you usually know when you remove the security threat. But then there was the move onwards to try and establish either democracy or a fairer governance system in Afghanistan. And I wonder whether or not you would, in the future, consider trying to separate them out, and whether you think it's actually achievable that someone from outside a society can make a significant contribution without the basis to build on within the society.
You know, you're absolutely right that it would be pointless without Afghan leadership. I mean, we weren't there to stay or to, you know, to stay or to invest or anything like that. It wasn't like that. It was about helping the Afghan government stand up. So yes, Afghan leadership critical. And in fact, everything we were doing in that last period, whether it was Dean working with the General Habibi, his partner, to reinforce the leadership of the Afghan Army or the RCMP, to do that with the Afghan police. It was about the Afghans. I mean, that was what we were trying to do and to get, but you couldn't do it without the military. You couldn't do it because if a district leader was going to a village, he'd get killed. So the ability to extend governance without minimum conditions of security and hard security against an opponent using terrorist tactics, an opponent that was invisible, an opponent that was woven into the fabric of society. The two had to work together, but it was it's like a very close dance, probably as hard as dancing tango, I'd say. So the two, I wouldn't separate them. There's a very, I didn't talk about this, but humanitarian spaces and how you find humanitarian spaces is extremely important. I think underutilized from a strategic point of view. One example was vaccination and days of tranquility. This was no Afghan wanted their kids to get sick, much less get polio. So everybody understood vaccination was the answer. But you need kind of a ceasefire to make it happen. You need kind of an understanding on both days that these days, we'll hang back and we'll let the vaccinators do their job. And that was very successful. That's something where you have to work with organizations like UNICEF and the International Committee of the Red Cross, who have that principle of impartiality that's there. But sometimes you also have to step out of the strict perspective of being a combatant trying to win, to make a space for these other things that benefits other people. I feel I didn't answer your question. Okay.
Yeah, thanks for the talk today. You had said in your talk that as part of, trying to implement democracy, at a minimum, you wanted to sort of instill values of do not torture and don't do extrajudicial killings. And yet the Canadians, JTF was handing over detainees to the Americans. The Americans were doing both of those things, torturing and extrajudicial killings. So I guess my question maybe is, do you think that sort of mission of trying to extend Canadian values to a region like Afghanistan was undermined from the beginning by the participation of the Americans? And just sort of to add to that, like you had I think alluded that AWK was maybe a CIA operative, maybe not, but all of these sort of things, like I guess maybe you don't want to answer it, but did the U.S. undermine the mission from day one?
No, no. It was a NATO mission. The United States had a preponderant role of military and political power. They made mistakes as well. But, and look, this wasn't, understatement of the year, this wasn't perfect. But I think if you talk about the detainee question, something that surprised me when I was leaving, I asked Kandaharis what they'd remember. And they said, and they're referring to the prisons and the treatment of detainees, and they said they would remember that Canada treated its adversary with dignity. Because everybody had a cousin or a brother-in-law or somebody who had passed through the prison system. And that's because they saw Canadians going in and monitoring prisons and reacting if there were any shortcomings to their well-being within international standards. So I think, that's an example, a specific example of where our work worked well and was felt and made a difference for that period. With the question of warlords, Canada was working with the United States to try and shift towards democracy, shift away from corruption, talk about how the money came in to these powerful people and see if that could be stopped. And like I talked about Ben, and we tried. Ben's analysis is that after the surge, the objective was to wrap it up and head back home and leave Afghanistan. So I think that was a point where, leaders ran out of patience with Afghanistan and Afghanistan leadership. So those would be my responses to your question.
Thank you for your talk. From your talk and my understanding, a prison is a very vulnerable place in Kandahar. So was there any de-radicalization program or PV programs there, rehabilitation program for the prisoners once they're captured?
I never observed a de-radicalization approach. What there was a peace process, incipient peace process starting. There was a council. Staniksai, I think he was leading it, of influential, respected Afghans to try and find a way. And there was also a demobilization program and I remember talking to a Taliban commander by accident about this, and he was saying, my guys, they're here, they're out of the woods. This was in actually the compound of Faizuddin Aga, the district leader, and he had called on people, say, okay, come on in. And if you're nonviolent and stuff, you'll be reintegrated in our community. And I think there was a social readiness for reintegration in a lot of places. But he said, I've applied for the demobilization money because I can't just let my guys go and be beggars. They need something, but I can't get the money from Kabul. So just getting the money through the chains of governance that happened in, whether it was paying the director of education or paying for demobilization funding, it didn't happen. So I think there was a feeling that there was a readiness to reintegrate, but the competencies weren't there, or the political will, or something wasn't there to happen. I'm still puzzled because I think that could have been a turning point and an exit ramp for the war.
So this is much more of a micro level question. We've been talking about malign actors, these local power brokers, especially in urban battle spaces, who you need to get along with to some extent. But obviously, like you said, there's expectations of behavior that come with that relationship. I was wondering if you could speak to what those discussions look like. Like when you get a guy who you're like, I've got to work with this local warlord, but he's obviously currently doing stuff that I can't have him doing if we're going to have a relationship. So I'm just wondering how those discussions happen, like how you address changes in behavior with someone like Karzai.
Well, first you talk to them. You go, I mean, that sounds obvious, but no, you go and meet him. And I met with Abdul Razak, the chief of the police, and I met with Karzai. And the line there was, any interference with this election is unacceptable. You can't count on Canada's support if there's this monkey business. And they listen and they hear. And I think the point there is for them to make a calculation. If they don't know we care, then they won't calculate. Now, how you calibrate the consequences, that can be in a different way. And it's hard because if you break a relationship with someone who's head of the provincial council and the brother of a president, there's consequences in both directions, right? But that message that you lose Canada's support, and then if there's continuing unacceptable behavior, then you escalate. You escalate to the level of the capital, and you escalate to the level of the president and other conversations. And that's basically what and you direct money. You cut money. Now, that's not always enough. That's what we did. I worked well with the detainees and torture issue, but that's what it looks like. You go and you talk, you try to be persuasive, you show the depth of your commitment, and then you calibrate the consequences and you keep escalating till someone who has more power cares.
How would you assess the relationship between ISAF and OEF?
Operation Enduring Freedom?
My tutor officer with the Combined Joint Special Operations Task Force.
Oh, man, that's a tough question. Well, you know more about it than me, I think.
Quite often we heard from the conventional side, the ISAF guys, that we were a waste of resources they could have used. Like they wanted the helicopter lift that we had. They wanted the surveillance and reconnaissance assets that we had. They thought
Wait,
that
who
we
was
were-
who was a liability to who?
Well, they thought that
Who was they?
the
This-
ISAF guys.
The ISAF guys, yeah.
Were unhappy with the amount of support that the Combined Joint Special Operations Task Force was getting, which is Americans, British, Canadian, and Australian special officers.
I never heard that. I never heard that. I think, you know, there's different missions. There were, I mean, the part of the complexity was different missions. There was a counter-terrorist mission happening at the same time as a governance mission. Sometimes there was friction between them. Night raids were always brought up in our meetings. They were socially distressing to Afghans at the same time as they were militarily perhaps the best way to avoid casualties and get a target. So I don't know. It's a super good question. It's a multi-level question. I think it's an interesting thing to consider the frictions that emerge between different missions in the same battle space, but it's not only a battle space, it's a political space, it's a social space, and it's an economic space.
We also had bourbon.
You had bourbon? You had different rules? There was like no drinking and no fraternization for us. Okay.
Thank you very much for the talk you offered. I have a bit of a more basic question for you because some of my other question was answered in the previous one. Could you offer a bit of a juxtaposition in how you felt individually between leaving in 2014 and the 2021 fall of Afghanistan and the government that you helped to establish?
Bad and bad. I felt, well, I think I said this. I felt bad leaving because I felt there was more we could do. And, you know, at the human level, you ask people to commit to you and your mission. A lot of people died. A lot of Afghans got killed. Most of the civilian leaders we worked with got assassinated in the Taliban assassination campaign. So I felt bad because there was more we can do. I felt bad because we didn't crack that problem of the Taliban assassination campaign. It became clear, I think, to the opponents that it's hard to hit a NATO soldier. It's really hard to hit a NATO soldier. It's really quite hard to hit an Afghan soldier. So the soft underbelly of our strategy was knocking off the mayor, the deputy governor, the minister of education, these things. And we never really cracked that problem. And of course, these local leaders, they're working in a political space and they got to be with the people. Like if they're not there and wearing a flak jacket and a helmet and dark glasses, they didn't do it. So I think that was, I felt bad. I felt bad because I was unsatisfied that we worked hard enough to crack the corruption problem. I also knew we were leaving, so we didn't have very much runway to continue. And then I was shocked when Kabul fell. And the way I felt then was I have to reach out to my interpreters and the Afghans to see if they're okay, if they were able to get out. And then there's that personal feeling. I mean, these are friends, colleagues, and their lives are turned upside down. And then trying to track that, and Dean, I think you felt that too, that we have like a human obligation to help these people we work with as much as we can. But it's a bit hard to penetrate the Canadian refugee system to provide, you know, that kind of influence. You can work, you can do it, but it's insulated from that. So bad and bad.
We have
But-
time for, oh, sorry.
But I do think it's important that we have a philosophical reckoning with that reality. And that's why I go back to these strong points. And I think, wouldn't we be betraying the memory of the people who sacrificed if we didn't try and learn from this? So I feel good about that.
We have time for one last question.
Can you comment, excuse me, can you comment on the inability of the Afghan army to win the battle?
There's somebody in this room who can comment much better than I, but he doesn't have to.
Well, I would just say that it's a great question, and it was one of the aspects that bothered me, because we put a lot of effort, especially, you know, our second mission of training the Afghans from essentially 11 to 2014. I would say, first of all, we did leave too early. Canada was the second largest contributor to the training mission. And we were trying to build their institutions. We were trying to build their recruiting system. We were trying to build their training system from the bottom up, all of their schools. We were trying to build the capabilities that, you know, Western worlds have had for years, the military colleges and all of that. And we were being very successful. We were building their special forces. Canada left in 2014 and nobody replaced us. So we took 1,000 soldiers that were training, and the Americans again had to try and fill the places. The Australians tried to fill in our spots, the Brits. So I think when we left, I felt like we were at about 50%, maybe. General Habibi, I asked this very same question to General Habibi. I said, why?
General Habibi was the commander of the Afghan Army in Kandahar, and
With me, he was
Yeah,
he
with-
was my partner. So he was the equivalent. Well, actually, he was one brigade. There was a two-star ahead of him, but we worked a lot with him, and then he continued to move up the chain of command. But you know, he saw it right until the end. We got him out of Afghanistan when the Taliban had his phone, and he was just about done. He was one of the last people that we got over that irrigation ditch with some special forces guys onto an airplane back here to Canada. But he'll tell you that we might have maybe, with the Americans and the rest of NATO, because NATO, they carried on training. And I will say we left with Singapore when we left in 2014. So we left for me, it drives me nuts that we left in 2014. We left a team and all that, but I think they may have got them to about maybe 70, 80%. But there's more complications to that, their leadership and how they choose their leaders, and the political dynamics with Ghani. And he was starting to pick leaders that weren't prepared to fight. It was how they were choosing their leaders. Because, you know, our armies have developed through years and years and years. They've been at war for 40 years, 50 years. So the whole succession planning and the whole evolution of building a strong force would have taken another probably 10, 15 years. So he'll say that they were at about 80%, but they put the wrong leaders in the critical positions, so that when the Taliban did hit them, with the political leadership at the time not strong, and then the military leadership not there, and the whole training system not at a level that was good enough to beat the Taliban, you know, who had been training in Pakistan and supported by a whole bunch of very capable forces. So that's about as good as answer as I can give you. But I was shocked at how easy it was. But I think it does come down to leadership, and it also comes down to the top leadership not being able to really give the forces what they needed as we were drawing down. And I honestly think that we did need to stay a little bit longer and I guess we could go on forever. but the unwinnable piece. I mean, I didn't like Tim's topic because I don't think anything in the title, and him and I have talked about this for days, and unwinnable peace. I say nothing's unwinnable. But I'll tell you, this Afghanistan, oh, Tim and I could go on this. There was so many extenuating circumstances, the Pakistans, the Irans, the stands to the north, the Russians, the poor leadership, the fact the country had been at war for 40 years. We're trying to help a country that just had so many dynamics that were hard to beat. You know, that's what really Tim's book is such a great title in the end, because it was unwinnable because of that. But there was just so many other factors that made it so that the Afghan forces just didn't really have a leg to stand on. But maybe would have in another God knows how many years. But that's a long-winded answer, but very
It's a big
passionate
question.
about it. So back to my challenge.
For those that are listening at home, the gentleman that was just speaking was Major General Dean Milner, who is Canada's commander for the last combat rotation 2010, 2011, as well as the last iteration of Canada's support to the training mission in 2013, 2014, affectionately known as the closer. Tim, you gave a great presentation, a heartfelt, really, after having spent the year with you in Kandahar. It really brought back a lot of emotions. And I think for those in the audience who hadn't had the luxury of that same period of time in Afghanistan, I think you made it live that experience. And
Thanks,
it's
Howard.
definitely in your book. And I want to give you just a moment to talk about your book, if that's okay.
Yeah.
But before I do that,
Oh, wow.
Yes. The
I knew.
CIDP coin.
That's so
The
cool.
last time
That's
we did
so
this, it was
cool.
you giving me your coin.
Yeah.
So here we go.
Thanks very much. Can the camera get this? Thanks very much, Howard. That's an honor. Yeah, well, I hope you'll buy my book. It's interestingly, Afghans really like my book. My second book. The first one was a political thriller. I wrote it after I came back to Afghanistan. I came back with a huge load of anger, I have to say, for a couple of reasons. One was the corruption warlord thing. And so I decided to write a novel to express these ideas in a way that's accessible, kind of fun. It's a political thriller. It's called Moral Hazards, which was the motto of our political analysis team, Moral Hazards. And it's about a Canadian woman human rights leader caught in a deadly conflict between a corrupt Italian general and a cunning warlord in the early 90s operation of Somalia. Gone wrong. So I'd recommend that. And then I put it up for an award. Did pretty well, didn't win. But there was a publisher on the jury who said, you know what, Canada does not have an accessible, readable book about the experience in Afghanistan, and you've been there. So I took that thriller style, interviewed 25 people. It's not Tim. It's 25 different men, women, Afghan Canadians on how they saw it, how they felt. And it tells the story of the campaign, the history, and the different things, the prisons, the development, the education, the governance in the villages, in the cities. So thanks very much for your attention. Thanks for allowing me to talk about my book, and wishing you all the very best.